My journey started December of 2015. I went in for just a routine mammogram. I had a history of benign tumors in the right breast, but this routine mammogram was starting to show some suspicion in the left breast. But I didn't have any concern about it whatsoever because of the history that I had in the right breast since 1999. I've had 2 open biopsies in the right breast where they removed numerous tumors, and then biopsies were done, and the outcome was they were always benign, non-cancerous. So when I got the call, I needed to come back in because I need to have some additional views. I didn't think anything about it. Been there, done that. When I went in, they then said that they need to do an ultrasound. That was normal because always ultrasound needed to be done. And then the radiologist came in and said, we have discovered some suspicious activity and we need to do a biopsy. I used to say, when you're in that type of situation, the worst is not knowing, until I got the call a few days before Christmas in 2015. When the pathologist called, she asked how I was doing. I laughed and said, well, I guess it depends on what you're about to tell me, and I laughed. But when she did laugh and she got quiet, I knew that what she was probably about to tell me. And that's when she said, I'm sorry, but you have breast cancer. I immediately went into a state of shock. No, I don't know what she said after that. After she said the word cancer associated with my name, it was truly for me the worst news that I could have ever gotten. Just so happened I was at my church. I went back in and told the pastor the news I had just gotten. He called me in his office. He cried with me. He prayed with me. And I was at least able to get my composure together to drive home and call my person, which is my daughter, and give her the news. I went through the protocols that was required of me. I went and saw my primary care physician so he could give me the official news of my diagnosis. He then referred me out to an oncologist and a surgeon. And my oncologist was probably the right one for me because he was arrogant. He was non-compassionate. And as he is talking to me about radiation chemo, every time he said the word radiation chemo, I responded, but I don't want radiation chemo. And he would say radiation chemo, and I said, but I don't want radiation chemo. Well, when you see the surgeon, make sure he puts a port in. And I said, well, what do I need a port for? For your chemo. I said, but I don't want chemo. So he must have said it 20 times. I must have responded the exact same way every time. So he could not, though, talk to me really about chemo in detail because he didn't have the 3rd page of my pathology report that had the hormonal part of my pathology. So he rescheduled me to come back in, and I came back in a few days when he had that part of my pathology report. And he came in the room saying, I've got great news. You're triple negative. I can now offer you chemo. But I didn't know what triple negative meant. And I responded the exact same way that I always responded, but I don't want chemo. So he went on, was explaining some other things about the different type of chemos, and then he mentions chemo. So finally, I stopped him and said, listen, instead of us doing this dance, and every time you bring up the word radiation chemo, and I say I don't want it, and you totally ignore me and what I'm saying, why don't you simply ask me why I don't want chemo? And he goes, what? I said, ask me. He said, okay, why don't you want chemo? I said, well, first of all, I was a bone marrow donor for my sister who was diagnosed with leukemia 34 years ago. She needed a perfect match, and of all the siblings, I was her perfect match. So we went to Fred Hutch Research Center, which was the place that you go back then, to have a bone marrow transplant. We went through the whole procedure exactly the way it needed to be done. While it did give her another year of life, she hasn't been with us now for over 30 years. And then I told him about my past career experience where I was a doctor assistant and I ran medical offices for over 23 years. And in that 23-year career, I worked for oncologist and hematologist. And I got to see firsthand what it was like when someone came in like myself that was full of energy, full of life, and had a will to live, and how quickly their health changed and how quickly the life was literally poisoned out of them. One day I'd be talking to them, they looked as healthy as I did, and then on Monday I'm opening up the mail and there's their death certificate. I vowed then, and that was in my late 20s, that if God forbid, if the worst news ever that I have gotten, which is cancer, I would never submit myself to such a barbaric protocol. Well, instead of having empathy for me and understanding why I didn't want radiation chemo, he simply looked at me straight in the eye and said, "You have no choice but to get radiation chemo." Well, that's all he needed to say, because I stood up, because I had already been doing my research. I stood up and said, "Oh yes, I do have a choice. I have a choice to get radiation chemo, and I have a choice not to get radiation chemo." So you haven't heard a word that I've said yet. So now let me say it in words that maybe you'll now understand. I will not be getting radiation, and I will not be getting chemo. And he goes, "You're not?" I said, "No." So I walked out that day, fired my oncologist. I knew what I wasn't going to get. Now I had to find a place that treated in my own belief system, that needed to be holistic, that needed to give my body what it needed, because I knew that God had designed our bodies to heal itself. All we needed to do is to give it what it needed to have to be able to do that. And from my research, I knew that the immune system was the key to my survival. So then I started my research. I went and researched several facilities. I knew in order to get the treatment that I need that it was not going to be easy, that it was not going to be provided in the U.S., because in the U.S., all that is offered is what they call the big three, which is surgery, radiation, chemo. Well, the problem that I had with the standard of care, besides of my past experience with my sister and the fact that when I worked for the oncologist and hematologist, where I saw how frail and how sick and what a suffering protocol the standard of care was. I'm a businesswoman, and I always was the person that handled stats in the companies that I ran. And stats is a measuring stick of how well a company is doing. So I started searching for stats. And when I ran across the stat that the overall success rate of the standard of care was a 2 to 3% success rate, I needed better stats than that. So I started doing my research, and I found 3 facilities that I was considering, but there was one that I was just drawn to because it was because of the fact of how they addressed cancer. This facility, New Hope Unlimited, treated cancer differently and looked at cancer differently. Instead of trying to put a Band-Aid or treating the symptoms of cancer, they went to the cause of cancer and treated the cause through immune therapy and supportive therapies. And that intrigued me. And when I found that, I knew that that was my best shot at survival. So I was a single woman. retired on a fixed income. If anybody could say that they couldn't afford an out-of-pocket program, it was me. My budget was as tight as it could possibly be. But I realized that if I had the right protocol, then I knew that I could fight cancer and win. So I said, well, I don't have it in my budget, but let me see what I do have. So I started searching. Well, I had a long career where I had a 401k that I had contributed to. Well, it just didn't make good business sense for a single female who was retired on a fixed income to dip into their 401k. But the way I looked at it was this. If I use that money and got the treatment that I need and survived cancer, I didn't know how. I said I could always go back and earn it back. But if I didn't use that money and I didn't survive cancers, it would just go to somebody else anyway. So I just took a leap. I know the noise that's out there. I know the scare tactics that our doctors use, and the scare tactic that my doctor used to try to convince me to get under the standard of care was the triple negative and the fact that I was a grade 3. It was my own research that I realized and found out what a grade 3 was and what a triple negative was. All my friends and family wanted to know, what stage is it? What stage are you? And when I said a stage 1, they go, oh, well, they caught it early, you're going to be just fine. But when I did my research and I found out what a grade 3 was, a grade 3 is the cancer cells are wild and woolly and fast spreading. And a triple negative meant I was no longer producing the 3 hormones that had receptors to receive treatment, good or bad, which is the most difficult to treat type of cancer cells because it is resistant to treatment. So traditionally, my prognosis was very poor. It would have been surgery, chemo, surgery, chemo, surgery, chemo, until I was no longer here. And I had decided that I would rather put my life in the hands of my Creator and just take my chances rather than submit myself to that 2 to 3% success rate and such a barbaric treatment. So in my research, I found New Hope. I felt drawn to them immediately. I spoke to a patient care coordinator. When I was told the cost, that's when I said, well, here's what I do have. I was reminded of the woman in the Bible that had the blood disease. And she had spent all that she had on physicians, and yet she was not well. But she said that if, as Jesus was walking by, if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I know that I'll be made whole. And that word just spoke to me that I have to be willing to give all that I have if I wanted the result. So I did. I put it all on the line. I decided, well, this is either going to be the best decision that I ever made, or I'm not going to live to tell or live with the fact that it was the worst decision that I ever made. So I put it all on the line. I can honestly say, and I can't describe to you what it's like to treat at New Hope. I really didn't have the barriers that some had about the fact that it's in Mexico. I was attracted to the protocols, and I was attracted to the success rate, and I was attracted to the treatment. You know, you can argue a lot of things. You can argue protocols, you can argue whatever, but you can't argue results. I am here to tell you today that I am now, there is no evidence of disease. I played full out. I connected to my Creator. I stayed focused on the end result, and I got the result that I believed for. If you're here watching this video today, I want to tell you that no matter what your doctor tells you, you do have a choice, because I'm living proof. Thank you.